Well, hi there, everyone. It's Christy, and unlike what I said in the last Hangout when I couldn't tell time, this Hangout is happening 30 minutes after the last Patreon Hangout, where I was incorrect in thinking it was a 90-minute gap, but it's we're back on air, so hello and welcome. And I am here today to talk with Mal McGuire, who is one of the creators and directors of the documentary Male Tears: The Hidden Side of Domestic Violence. He's also a founder and director of a nonprofit group for male domestic violence victims. So Mal, thank you for reaching out and giving me an opportunity to discuss your project, because I had planned for a very long time to mirror Captain McCool's video asking people to support your project, and then life got in the way and it was sort of weighing on my mind. So when your project reached out to me to be on the channel, I was really happy to say yes. So thank you very much for reaching out.
Hey, and thanks for having me. This is awesome.
Yes, it's great. So for those, just assume that members of the audience have no idea about the project itself, the documentary. So let's start with the project that you're working on, and also links to the Kickstarter. Is that the group you went with? Or is it GoFundMe?
Indiegogo.
Okay, an Indiegogo link will be in the description box below. So yeah, tell the 6 people watching right now a bit about the project itself, and then we'll get into the background and your interest in it.
Sure. So we're doing a documentary on. It's funny because I wish I was more articulate about this. It's not just about male victims of domestic violence or male domestic violence victims or whatever. It's mostly about my personal experience of it, how that was transformative for me, celebrating the positive outcomes and the journey that I went on afterwards, both in a sort of healing and self-awareness kind of area, and looking at how society looks at this problem and trying to explore how we can come to a place that is more understanding, more compassionate, and actually leads to solid results where there's people who aren't getting help out there. We can find ways to get them the help they need.
Great.
It's a really circuitous way for me to answer that question.
No, that's fantastic. So it's
I'll get better at this as we go. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a personal journey, but it's tying to larger issues and how society deals with that, and how we, individually kind of approach this issue.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, great. So tell me a little bit more about the people that you're working with and how you guys got connected up and involved in the project.
Oh, sure. Sorry, by the way, is my camera off?
Yes, your camera is off, so I'm just seeing your icon. You're welcome to put it on. I
sorry about
am having a lazy Sunday. My hair is crazy. There's no way I'm going on camera like this, but my voice will do. So
yeah, sure. Is it on now, or oh, there it is. All right. Sorry about that. I'm a bit of a fuddy-duddy, and I'm new to this technology thing.
That's fine.
Yeah.
So yeah, you and your the project partners.
Yeah, my project partners. Okay, so I have 2 project partners. One is Tucker Bottomley. Now, Tucker is a real dear friend of mine, and is the first person that I disclosed I was being abused to, and also rescued me from the relationship in a very physical way. And so there's Tucker, and then there's David McGinnis, who is a practicing therapist, hypnotherapist, and counselor, who was a big part of my healing journey afterwards, especially when it came to dealing with helping me with PTSD and panic attacks and anxiety, that sort of stuff.
Right. And we've talked a little bit around it, what the documentary is about and your project partners and how you got connected with, I think it was Tucker. But yeah, do you want to tell a little bit about your experience and how this affected your life and became the impetus for the documentary project that you're currently working on?
Yeah, it's funny, a long time ago, just as a precursor to that, I have 2 daughters, and I was telling them that I was going to be teaching people about, I wasn't telling them that it was domestic violence, but I was trying to put together a talk for a university, and I was doing notes, and they were like, "Daddy, what are you doing? You're ignoring us." And I said, "I have to do this thing. Give me a second." And my youngest said, "What are you going to talk about?" And I said, I don't know. And I was thinking, would be forgiveness or neuroplasticity or the healing journey and stuff like that. And she said, you should talk about love. And I said, why? And she said, because people think love's funny, and it's not. It's serious. And that stuck with me. And I think what we're looking at when we look at why people stay in an abusive relationship, we often talk about their generational trauma that's been handed down. We talk about family of origin. We talk about everything but love. And that's turns out to be a pretty big factor in why people stay. So anyway, I fell in love. And I had been married for 20 years and had been separated. And, you know, a couple of months later, I met this lady. And, you know, that looked great. So being married for so long, I think that makes you, you know, sort of wary about a relationship in the first place, but also fairly invested when you do get in one because you don't want to go through another separation. Anyway, she was great, absolutely amazing, brilliant. And of course, there was that chemistry and spark. She was a wonderful conversationalist, and I just loved spending time with her. And we got very close fairly fast. And little by little, she became more and more sort of touchy and sensitive, and then upset, and then kind of angry, and then eventually, over a period of time, it snowballed into a full-on, totally abusive relationship. And if you can imagine your typical scenario that you would imagine, you know, with a man and a woman where the man's abusive, it was basically like that. It's funny because I'm kind of excited to talk to you about gender roles, how society looks at gender roles. Because in our relationship, just after I met her, my father died. My mother committed suicide when I was 13. So when my dad died, just after meeting this lady and we started to date, that was devastating. And I was in the orphan club. So, you know, for years, I had worked a couple of jobs, had my own business, had 2.4 kids and a house and a wife. And I was fulfilling that gender role. And after my dad died, I decided to take a year off, and I became the de facto house husband. So there was me, there was her, and she had her kid. And on the weekends, I had my kids. And for that entire year, I stayed home and I cooked and cleaned. And she had a very, very great job with the federal government and, you know, the business suits, power suits and stuff. So our roles were kind of reversed in that way, you know. So it eventually, like I said, it became increasingly more abusive physically, emotionally, psychologically, and to the point of me being battered on a regular basis, sustaining a lot of injuries, and, you know, just generally having a really crappy time. I'm sort of underplaying it here, but it was actually really bad.
I'm muting my mic because there's background noise and I want people to hear your story without interruption.
Sure.
So,
So I'm happy to answer any questions about anything, really. You know, when it comes to the trauma and the violence and the psychological stuff and the sexual pressure and all these other aspects, because it's a fascinating area to talk about. So basically, I don't know why I always have to bring this up, but a lot of people always ask, you know, was she bigger than you? And at the time, you know, I weighed about 130. I don't anymore. I've got a little bit of a dad bod. And I'm, you know, I'm 5'6". She was like 5'10" and weighed about 170. So she was bigger than me, and you know, this was a very athletic person, and she got really angry a lot, and you know, when she got upset and started to strike at me, I didn't do a good job of protecting myself, and I got hurt a lot. So, you know, there was like bloodshed. There was, you know, she broke a tooth of mine, and she broke my toe at the door and did stuff like lock me out of the house, kept me in the basement for a couple of weeks. She took away the phone, did all the controlling stuff, took away the TV, took away the computer. Sometimes she unplugged the lights if I wanted to read. It was incredibly controlling. And partway through that experience, one day when she attacked me quite savagely, I actually disclosed to a friend of mine what was happening. and that was I don't know how to describe it. That was weird because, he didn't really help me. He was just kind of shocked and didn't know what to do. And I kind of endured another 9 months of that stuff. So.
Right. And then when was the moment of realization that you were in an abusive relationship and you needed to find a way out? How did that sort of process come about?
Well, actually, it was all Tucker. Like I said, I disclosed to Tucker. I went over to his house and took off my shirt and showed him what had happened to me. And through the rest of the year, he had seen some of the injuries that I had and that sort of thing. He came over to the house one time, and I was really terrified that she would go off again, and kept me safe by coming over to the house. And then shortly after that, he was like, okay, because he was physically there to see her have like a psychological meltdown. He told me, he said, I had no idea you were living with this, how bad it was. And then a few weeks later, she had another episode, and I called him for help, and he got a couple of friends to move me and got a truck and got me out of there.
And then the next stages of trying to find your life again and put your life back together. Can you talk a little bit about what you dealt with as a consequence of leaving, and then where things sort of went to there, where you were able to start to deal with this and recognize the need out there in society for these places and these discussions to be happening?
Yeah. Well, actually, I was really lucky. About 2 weeks after I was out of there, I decided to take a Qigong weekend retreat, which is kind of like which I thought was a good idea at the time. Anyway, so I met this lady, and we introduced ourselves in the circle and told people what we did. And she was an abuse counselor. So, I took her aside and told her why I was there, and she was fantastic. She talked to me all weekend long for hours, and she was so understanding. She was so helpful. She clarified so many things for me. And after the end of the weekend, I said, listen, this has been amazing, and I am dying to come to your office and continue this journey. And she looked at me like, somebody had run over my dog. I was like, what? And she said, well, you can't come to the office. We counsel women who have experienced violence, and we rehabilitate men who use it. So our policy doesn't allow for you to come. And she said, we have a lot of work to do to reach out to men like you. So Christy, I can't tell you how I was so hurt by that. I was so crushed because I didn't know what to do. Counseling is expensive, and felt like I was losing out on free counseling. Of course, I felt, nobody loves me.
Yeah, there's no support system for you.
Yeah, and I didn't get angry about it at all. I think there's a lot of misogynistic men out there who found some sort of avenue where they were seeking support or help, or were traumatized by the system in some way. And yeah, that was traumatizing, but it sort of made me think about, okay, I have a really good friend of mine, Dr. Jeff Garabinow. He's the head of social work at Dow here in Halifax, and he started an overflow shelter for transient people. That's co-ed, and it's the only one in Halifax. And I asked him why he started that, and he said he went to India, he saw a lot of homelessness, and it rocked him. And when he came back here to Halifax, he just had to do something. So that's kind of how it was for me. That experience just rocked me, and I just didn't want any man ever in my position to ever hear those words. We're not allowed to help you. That just felt so wrong. So, about a year later, I bumped into a wonderful social worker named Robert Wright. At the time, I was homeless because I was going through a real downward spiral, depression, anxiety, and grief, and stuff like that. And I was getting sick with this blood infection from a broken tooth, and I just fell apart completely. So, I bumped into this guy, and he had been working for years with male victims of sexual violence. So, I said, well, hey, at the moment I'm kind of homeless, but I'd love to work on getting a group together for male victims of domestic violence. And yeah, he just gave me his card, and 2 years later, we got a grant for $6,500 to create an education platform for human services providers and a space for having a peer support group. However, that was a huge triumph. Like, apparently in Canada, that's the most money that's ever been put out for that reason. However, in the community center where this was to happen, they got a new leader, a new director, and she was vehemently opposed to having a peer support group for male victims within her. She didn't want to do it, and she delayed on the grant and vacillated, and then eventually we lost the opportunity to do that, which again was devastating. And this was a person who just didn't want to support the idea, which I couldn't wrap my head around at all. But that was really, really horrible. So it was like back to square one, and myself and 4 other people came together, and we started our own nonprofit society for male victims, and we just actually got it registered on August the 4th.
Congratulations.
So, yeah, thanks. So that's the first one in Canada that I'm aware of, and it's been a long journey. It's been fraught with all sorts of craziness and a surprising amount of incredible support from lots of people, and a weird amount of resistance from a small but vocal cadre of people who are vehemently against helping men. And they exist, but they haven't really. This one person is an individual, and maybe she just doesn't like that idea. But what was I going to do? Complain, make it, whatever. I just kind of brushed that aside and went, okay, well, let's move forward anyway. So that's been a real journey there. And everything I think about domestic violence has been completely turned upside down. But I do have to tell you this. One of the things that I noticed, I had an amazing journey towards healing and finding resources. And I think this is important for people to understand. Everybody understands that people who are in an abusive relationship feel very isolated. And the isolation is increased to a degree if you're a male because of the stigma, that there is about that. And a long history of terrible police responses, which makes it terrifying to report. And of course, there's a lack of resources. There's no counseling, there are no shelters. So it's incredibly difficult if you're a man in that situation to report in the first place, because it's almost like, well, what's the point? I have nowhere to go, and no one's going to help me anyway. That's horrible. It kind of breaks my heart. Just, if I hadn't gone through it, it would still be a horrible thing. And I just feel, what I found though was that, okay, I had no resources, so I bumped into people along the way who were amazing, like the social worker, Robert Wright, and another social worker at a community place who helped me personally deeply with free counseling for 1.5 years. I mean, she was incredible. And also there was a community, like the guy who ran the homeless shelter, he's still friends with me. We're having coffee later this month.
Mhm.
The people at the shelter were amazing. The outpouring of compassion and support has been unbelievable. Victim services were great here. And I met an incredible amount of women. And I find this very interesting because the men who I was talking to were much, much more mellow and kind of like, you know, there, buddy, about stuff. Women were asking me really hard questions, the most challenging intellectual questions about my experience and what to do in the future. There seemed to be a real outpouring of incredible support, mostly from feminists, who saw this as an incredible opportunity to make change. And it's been a wild journey. So I kind of want to document that. You know what I mean?
Sure. And what is your goal for the documentary? Is it mostly like raising awareness, or is there a political goal that's tied to the outcome of the film?
You know, indirectly, yeah, I suppose. I think people really react to a human story and all the ramifications that can come from that, be they political or even personal growth and change or personal awareness, they can come from that human story. And I've got a really cool story. I mean, this was like, you know, this was like the Wild West. It was really violent, and she was really upset a lot, and I was really hurt. And, you know, it was biblical levels of betrayal and sex and death, right? And I think people react to those human stories, but yeah, I do want to see change. And I think video is incredibly powerful. Now, no one's ever done a documentary ever on male victims of domestic violence. That topic has never been done. But here's the other thing. I want to make a documentary artistically that is educational, but that isn't horrible to watch. I've watched every documentary I can find on domestic violence, and they're almost like, it's like you want to unsee them. You see this woman who's been put through hell, and the guy who did it is like a complete monster, and nobody learns anything, and there's no positive outcome. It's just, this is how horrible the situation is, and yeah, they're almost down to the last one exactly the same. So I've got to do something different. I want to create a culture of hope and give people the way, to learn how to respond if somebody in your life is going through this, and how to respond in a way that maybe locally they can make change. So that's kind of what I hope the outcome will be. Maybe if you watch this thing, you might have a buddy that you suspect is going through a hard time, and then you can take them aside and talk to them. That's a political outcome. As well as a bigger one would be, maybe you can start in your own town a peer support group if you care about this issue. Maybe you can talk to people in your circles and see if there's a possibility of making a change when it comes to allocation of funds for education. Maybe there's so many things that could happen out of this that are really positive. That's what I'm hoping for. And I am not a very cynical person by nature, so it's not that pie in the sky to think that we can actually make difference with the documentary. I think video is incredibly powerful. So that's what I'm hoping.
That's great. Thank you very much for telling your story and raising this issue, and all of the work too that you have been doing and plan to do in the future, because it is work that needs to get done. I mean, and this is the thing about activism, is that sometimes there's a problem and nobody's dealing with it until somebody does. And then what I see in this situation is, it's my job as an ally, as a feminist ally, to basically solving the problem of abuse. To help give you a platform and a voice and raise my voice up in support, because we kind of talked about gender roles, and I wanted to say, when I thought about doing this hangout and what I thought I could bring to it, is that I think my intersectionality, when people talk a lot about intersectional third wave feminism and why it's a problem, but I think one of the reasons that why intersectional feminism, my feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit, is because my intersectional feminism allows me to look at the problem of abuse from a gendered way, as well as how it disproportionately, you know, the gendered nature of how it's been discussed up until this point. And so for me, what really I find depressing about the way that some people frame this issue is it's male victims versus female victims. And what
Right.
that doesn't do is say the problem is abuse. The problem is abuse in, you know, same-sex relationships, for trans people, for cis people, you know, for married people, for dating people. The problem is abuse. And the problem isn't taking money away from women's shelters to give to men. It's to start funding our our support services properly for all of the people who need it. And that is how I think, you know, why intersectionality and feminism is so important, because it's much easier for me to draw on a wider range of people's experiences, and the way that abuse is, the nature of how that abuse plays out is gendered, or, you know, has those kind of, you know, how the roles are taken up by the abuser and the abused might depend on the sex of the participants. But we can't, you know, we need intersectionality to see that larger problem and actually deal with it holistically, as opposed to setting people up against each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, one of the things I did want to touch base with you on is these gender roles and the pressure that it puts on people, and how that really limits your life in a way. May I give you an example?
Please,
You
please,
know,
yeah,
an
go ahead.
anecdote. Okay. Well, okay. So I mentioned that, you know, I have the typical thing. Look, first of all, I'm not a very macho guy in the first place. I tend to have a bit more of a nurturing side by nature, and but I had lived this life that you would expect a man to live, with working really, really hard, lots of hours, and raising a family, and starting a business, and all that. And I thought I was happy doing that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've done that my entire adult life. So here I am, I'm 42, and I wind up being a house husband. And you know, Christy, those were the happiest days of my life. I absolutely, before things went south, adored being home and taking care of the kids and helping them with their homework, and doing all the laundry and cooking all the meals. And I was shocked to know that I was absolutely in my element doing that. So I felt a sense of freedom and power in that role that I totally didn't expect. So do you have any comment on that in some way?
Well, only so far as that. I've had friends who had a similar setup in their house, where she was the primary breadwinner and he stayed home with the two boys. I think they were both under the age of 4 at the time, for several years. And yeah, things worked out for them just fine. So I think, you know, one of the things that I would like to, one of the reasons I critique patriarchy is because it really
Yeah.
confines people into, you know,
Right.
basically Bronze Age roles, and it denies us our full potential as humans. And I think one of the big problems, you're located in Canada, and I don't know, I can't speak to the coverage of in the newspaper, but there was recently coverage in the US about how men are quite hesitant to take family leave because of the culture of their corporations. They're seen as not being, you know, proper men for taking time off work to go spend time raising their children. And that to me is messed up. You know, like having a person who's a happy dad and has a happy family life because he's there for his kids is not just good for the society, but it's good for him as an employee, rather than feeling like he's not being there. So yeah, I think that the notion of gender roles is one that the more we can move toward, look, if it makes you happy, do it. Like, that's the only important thing. It's not whether or not, you know, what your plumbing is. It's whether the two of you can work out a relationship where you both feel contented, and whoever takes on whoever roles is fine. It's also a reason why I'm a big proponent of having unisex diaper changing facilities, because so often they're in the women's toilets. And that means when guys are out with their kids, it's much harder for them to actually be a proper parent in a way that the woman would have access, because people always assume that it'll be the woman changing the nappies and that the man won't have, you know, the father won't have to do that.
Yeah.
So I think that there's little things in our society that always try to track men into being more the disciplinarian and less of the nurturer, and sort of the vice
Right.
versa with women.
Yeah. And see, that's what it comes down to for me, is that it's funny because I think of the word advocacy or activism, and I always sort of balk at that because I don't really consider myself an activist. although I suppose I kind of am. But that's really not where I don't really identify with that. Uh, I find people look at men's rights activists. The very term is anathema to them. You know, um, it's to me, I'm more of a men's nurturing advocate. One of the things that I was joking with a friend of mine. He was saying, so you know, why do you think? He was talking about how do you build this bridge between this concept, helping men, and creating collaboration with all the different strata of people in the feminist community. And what's wonderful about this conversation is that this is exemplifying collaboration. This is wonderful because it's actually putting it out there, you know, for all people to see that there is true collaboration on this topic, and that's wonderful. But I was just joking that, you know, it doesn't really help anybody to have I mean, do you really think it's a good idea to have a bunch of unhealed men running rampant around your town? You know?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this comes back to, I mean, there's a lot of issues here in terms of, you know, like issues of the way men are encouraged to repress their feelings, and this expectation, you know, creating this is the whole idea of toxic masculinity, these sort of places where men don't have healthy ways to process things. But I think, you know, what I said was, I want to get back to that before we move on, in that as a feminist, I see it as my job to help men who are working on issues of men's in areas where in society they are being disadvantaged or abused and need our help on a basic humanist principle. But I don't think it's the job of feminists to take this issue over from you, and for feminist activists to take on, you know, I think that it's our job to find people, you know, to connect with people like you, and then do what we can to support, because it's the same thing. Like, as a white person, I can't go, like, if I go and speak for Black Lives Matter and try to fix all the problem, then I'm basically sort of putting them back in that position of not being able to be activists for themselves. And that's why, again, I was encouraged at this opportunity, because I think, you know, we can both agree that at the end of the day, abuse is a humanist issue. And then there are gendered aspects to it that play out in a lot of different ways. And so far, you know, because of the work of second wave feminists who started to talk about domestic violence, and this is another thing, I guess, as long as I'm on the topic, you know, as a social scientist, our theories change over time. If you know, even the theory of evolution, when Darwin started out, he didn't understand the role of genes because he hadn't read the work of, is it Mendele? On bean plants and how chromosomes pair up. But when those two theories came together, it made sense because they complemented each other, and they've been connected ever since. And I see our understanding of abuse kind of going through that same process of theoretical development. So first, a problem is identified. It's identified within a group of people who are affected by it. In this case, it was, you know, women who are talking about domestic abuse, and they developed the narrative, they developed the theories, and took the issue forward and started to get more recognition for it, and it became a topic, and services became available, and it was something the government decided, you know, was important enough to involve itself in to make sure people were safe. But the discourse was basically heteronormative. It was assuming a man and a wife, and it assumed a patriarchal relationship where the man had the power and the woman didn't. And life is more complicated than that. That theory was good for one portion of the population, but it really didn't acknowledge it in any other part of the population. And so then you start to get critiques of the theory because of its own limitations. And then the expansion of who a victim can be gets widened. And we look more particularly at those communities, or those situations, should I say, to understand how different abuse-powered paradigms are manifest in different groups. So our theory becomes more refined, it becomes more nuanced, it becomes more demographically sensitive, and that means that we're understanding the problem better. And hopefully, again, instead of pitting different groups against each other, we can look at the problem of abuse in its the way it manifests, and try to cope with the victims of all of those and empower those people to get their lives back and get their hope back.
Yeah, and you know, that makes perfect sense. And you know, a lot of the problem stems from people's understanding of, well, how big a problem is it for men? And the stats conflict all over the place. You know, just here in this city, if you call victim services, they receive about, on average, 2,500 calls a year for domestic violence complaints. And around 34% on average are from men. So the thing to understand about that, so we're looking at 34% of men. That's a big number. That's about 11 to 1,200 men a year. If you look behind the stats, you have to realize, according to victim services, that men tend to only they don't call the first time they get slapped. They call after 25 years and they're at their wits' end, or they call when there's a real life-threatening situation. So that humanizes that, for people. It's really important to kind of look behind the stats and figure that stuff out. And stats can be confusing for people. How are they done? Police reports don't really represent, like if you look at Stats Can, they're looking at police reports. However, if men don't call the police that much, you can't really rely on those stats. There's a lot more men who are going through domestic violence in all its forms, from mild to severe, who aren't calling. And the other thing that is important to just at least recognize is that it's patently obvious that the amount of homicide, interpersonal or whatever homicide, is far worse for women than it is for men. We're talking about, for me, I'm focusing on the people who go through domestic violence, before it gets to homicide. And it also shows actually that women suffer deeper in some ways than men do from the results of domestic violence. The psychological impact, and this has been, I think there was a comprehensive study done in 2013 of all the studies. Can't remember what it's called, but it showed that the effect on women is really devastating, and that's another thing to take into consideration. There's a lot of nuances to all this stuff, but a lot of people also look at men as like, well, can't be that bad. For me personally, it was really bad. I mean, I suffered from terrible panic attacks and anxiety and depression, and I was grieving really hard because, like I said, I was in love, and that there's still a loss there, and that is also devastating. Men attach quite deeply, and sometimes we don't really look at that as compassionately as we should. And to, like, say in in my personal experience, one of the really, really sad things, by the end of it, my ex, when we actually separated, because we separated 2 weeks before I had to leave, sort of officially like separated, she told me, I have to stay away from you because I treat you so horribly. She was completely aware that she was in a cycle of abuse and couldn't get out of it. She just couldn't snap out of it until I was physically out of there. And I hope that she heals in some way, because I still, this is a person I still care about, and you can't see somebody in that kind of torment. And she had a terrible background. She suffered horribly, like psychologically. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and she just had a really horrible time. And I don't want to say that what she did is excusable, because it's not. She's also the worst person I've ever met in my life, but that doesn't mean that I can't still feel compassion and hope for her healing in the future. And that's part of the message.
So the cycle doesn't continue, that her next relationship doesn't also devolve into this.
Right, and of course, and I think this is my own personal story, but I did find out that she's been quite happy with another partner, and according to her sister, it's going really well. I think she learned something from that experience and is making her best effort. And to me, I think all I can say about that relationship for me was that there were positive outcomes. For me, lots of self-awareness and all this cool work that I'm doing. Look, I'm making a movie. This is fantastic, right? I always wanted to make a movie. Didn't expect to be making a movie about getting the shit beat out of me, but that's still fun. And I learned a lot about myself. And for her, well, she had always wanted to be able to live with a loving partner, and she's making her best effort at it. So, you know, there's positive outcomes that came out of it. And I hope that people can look at a movie like this and see that in an abusive relationship, yeah, you got to get out of there and it's not good. But what can you learn from it? Where can you take that into your life and weave the fabric of the damage into a positive way in your life? Whether it be more self-awareness, understanding, you know, what made you vulnerable to that? What made that person vulnerable to becoming violent? It's extremely rare, I think, for a woman to be as violent as she was. She was incredibly angry, and after talking to, like, we both saw 2 psychologists together and her separately, and it was devastating to hear what they had to say. I mean, this person is deeply tormented. For me, the big question was, well, why did you let her do it? You know, and I had to really sort of look up. Yeah, that's a really good question. Because normally, Christy, in a normal situation, you'd be sitting there, and if somebody came up and hit you, you'd be like, stop it and call the cops. And I didn't do that. So it was incredibly important for me to examine those things too. What makes us stay in these relationships? You know, for women, I think it's the same as men. I don't really see a huge difference in the reasons why they stay. So far, with all the women that I've spoken to, which has been amazing. I've spoken to so many women who've been in the same position as I was, and every time you sit down to talk, it's just the most amazing thing to have those kind of conversations. You know.
Yeah, I was, you know, kind of thinking about, we got some feedback there. What you were saying and the problem that we're facing. I mean, when you were talking initially, when you were telling your story, you said something along the lines of, you know, talking about her size versus yours, you know, giving a justification or, you know, explaining yourself. And to be honest, I mean, I was not really taken aback, but it would never have occurred to me to ask you that question. And I think
know, but a lot of people do.
I know, and I wanted, that's why I wanted to point it out, because this is the whole thing about when people say, you know, believe the victim. It's about giving the other person the time and not jumping down their throat. You know, like, you know, there, let's say just the truism, there's always 2 sides to every story. But in this case, you are talking honestly about something that happened to you that was obviously physically and emotionally traumatic. And my job as a good listener is not to say, well, why didn't you leave her? Or why didn't you hit her back? It's to, this is what, just listen and hear what the other person has to say. And yeah, and you know, so yeah, I think I wanted to take a moment to point that out, because you now, I think, you know, of your own accord, kind of given a couple defenses. And you're right, people ask, and I think the whole point of the asking is the real thing that we need to look at, is what are the assumptions you are making here that would encourage you to ask that question? That's
a great point, Christy. I'm really glad we're having this conversation, and that's something to consider. You know, it's funny. The one time I did get in touch with the police, that was the first question they asked: "Is she bigger than you?" And yeah, that you know.
What would it matter?
I know.
You know, if she slammed your hand in the door, your foot in the door, why would it matter how, you know, how much bigger she was? If there was an assault, there was an assault.
Right. And yeah, I know. So but that does come up, and you know, I think what we have to look at is that abuse is about coercion and control. I've had the most amazing conversations. I used to think that the abusive relationship part started when she started hitting me, but I was totally wrong about that. You know, the women I've spoken to who have been in it, they were basically saying, no, it started way before that. You know, when I first started dating her, I had been separated after a 20-year marriage, right? And she refused to be my girlfriend until I signed my separation papers. So that's coercion or a controlling thing. You know, it's an ultimatum. I'm not going to kiss you until you do this type of thing. And that was controlling. And, you know, I signed those papers the day after my dad died, you know, which was probably dumb. But, you know, sort of recognizing where coercion and control starts in your relationship is incredibly important. And that's part of the documentary, is to try to help people figure out, like, you might be in the beginning of an abusive relationship and you want to nip that in the bud.
This seems to me,
Are you being coerced?
I don't understand why we don't teach these in schools, in, like, you know,
Yes.
in healthy relationship, like home economics kind of stuff, you know, like understanding.
I know. Yeah, Christy, I mean, that's like huge, eh? I mean, I didn't even recognize the red flags, and I'm a fairly observant person. But now I would recognize them in a second. That's an amazing thing that I would like to get through in this documentary. Not that you want to be paranoid about your relationships, but you do want to recognize if someone is going out of step. And what a healthy relationship is not that. It can get out of control very, very quickly. And I did want to talk just briefly about part of the fact is it's incredibly important for men to be able to be comfortable with telling their story and the worst parts of it and the most embarrassing bits. So I'd like to tell you just two quickly embarrassing things. Because I think this is important, that I own the whole thing. It wasn't just that she was beating me up. She did stuff that was humiliating to me. She body shamed me. You know, she made fun of, not fun, she ridiculed my performance in bed and that sort of stuff. And like to the point where I was buying books, how to be a good lover and stuff like that. I was terrified I would lose her, right? Because I was just getting it from everywhere.
And if you lose her, no one else would have you, so you needed her, kind of thing.
Yeah, you know, I was working so hard. I went to therapy to learn how to deal with her. You know what I mean? My girlfriend's getting upset all the time. You know, help me. But she did things like, she used to get upset and, of course, withdraw affection. She would sleep on the couch. And, you know, I would always say, look, I'm not upset with you at all. If you have a problem, you're welcome to come to bed. And she would get upset and take away her pillow. And then over a year, it would escalate to her taking away her pillow. Then she'd come back and take away the blanket. And then she would come back and take away my pillow. It got really dumb. But one day, I had gone to this therapist and I had realized that she got upset so easy that I would disengage every time that she got upset. So whenever I felt her starting to get upset, I would say, okay, I'm going to give you space. And I'm going to disengage. And if you'd like to bring up this topic in 24 hours, let's do it when we have cool heads. And I did that consistently for 2 months. And that made it worse. She would go, the calmer I was, the more understanding I was, she would go berserk. And it got to the point one day where I was giving her that space, and I happened to have her comfy jammies on. And I was in the kitchen and she was in the bedroom, and she came out and she said, I want my pants. And I was like, what? And she made me take off her pants and give them to her. And she was so upset. I was like, okay, the kitchen door was open because it was a hot night. And I backed away and walked out onto the deck because I was scared she was going to hit me. And she locked me out in my underwear that night. And yeah, that's a story I don't tell that often. And I always wondered why I don't tell that story that often. I always talk about, oh yeah, she crushed my foot with the door, or she broke my tooth, or she strangled me, or whatever. But sometimes it's important to be able to own the parts of the abuse that are the most painful and that happens to be one of them that I still find hard to say, you know?
Right.
So thank you for listening.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think, what the important thing here is, again, yeah, giving a voice to this stuff, because there is such a taboo against men who say these kinds of things, and the backlash that you get. And it's not just from other men, but also women kind of hold to very patriarchal values of how, the John Wayne version of masculinity.
Yeah.
But breaking those molds in a way, and I think, that's what you're doing, is you're showing an example of a person who went through a terrible time, talking about that. And that you're a man shouldn't take away from the fact that that was a terrible thing that happened, because that's, again, comes back down to what humanism ultimately should be about, is respecting people and respecting human life and the quality of it. So to dismiss you, or say, or put some onus on you, basically victim blame, is the last thing that we should be doing as humanists. And also, when you talked about not really feeling, sort of doing indirect activism. During my college years, I was a member, my college was a member of the USSA, the United States Student Association, which is a totally left-leaning student group. But as part of it, we became trained in grassroots organizing. And they have a little mantra: educate, agitate, organize. So first you educate people as to the problem that they're not seeing or not aware of. And you give them a message, you agitate them about the problem, that this is stupid, we should fix this. And then the next step is to organize those voices into becoming the change you want to see in the world. Getting the legislation passed, getting the bill passed, degendering some of the language so that more victims are included. All of this kind of stuff, is a natural outgrowth of education. So again, I think, you were doing the educate and agitate, but then hopefully I would hope that it would be then some kind of organization in Canada to start more people would be inspired to organize, or you would organize.
And that's what the nonprofit is about.
Yeah,
that's right. That's what the nonprofit is about. So I guess I did get to the organization part eventually, and I'm excited about that. Part of this, actually, it's part of the healing process too. I mean, if you look at there's thousands upon thousands of men in Canada alone who've been through domestic violence. I mean, there's 1,100 to 1,200 per year in this city. That's, we're talking year upon year upon year. There's millions. But I really took this quite far. I'm making a documentary about it. I started a nonprofit. I worked to get a grant on the go. I'm raising awareness. I'm not super political, but this has just become a passion of mine, because it's just I feel called to do, and it seems to work. People who I speak to, I think, really respond to the fact that I've gone through a lot of healing, that I'm not particularly bitter, and that I'm hopeful. All these things are really good elements to have if you are going to network with people and organize. I think people really respond to enthusiasm and optimism, as opposed to anger and rage.
Definitely, most definitely. And also, I think, it opens up an important opportunity for us to talk about our masculine norms, and why is it, why would we victim blame a man who came forward asking, well, was she bigger than you, or why didn't you hit her back? Again, that sort of fundamental question of why are you asking that? Because when I, look at the legislative body and look at the people who make it up, you should have a really great advantage going and talking to them, saying, hey, there are these men's issues. Most of you guys here are guys. This is something that affects other men. Let's start addressing it. And yet, maybe it's through people not coming forward enough, or people in legislative bodies not taking it seriously because of patriarchal notions of what men are and aren't, and how men can be victims. I mean, this is also a blindness that we have to male victims of sexual assault and rape. We have it with the problem of men who are raped in prisons, and sexual abuse generally in prisons for men and women. But there is it's a rather pathological blindness that men who hold power haven't really addressed these problems on behalf of their own community, and you end up, because feminists made a stink about it, and they worked on it for 30 or 40 years. That's well established now, the whole idea of women as victims but men as perpetrators. you are out there challenging that narrative, and I'm glad that a lot of feminists have been on your side, and I'm disappointed that that woman let you down, because I think that grant proposal would have been a great investment in the community and
Yeah.
in helping people. For the amount of money you were asking for, it would have done so much more good than it could have, you know. So, but anyway, yeah. And then the question is, you know, how do we get these topics brought before legislators and to really get them to think about it, not in so much as this historical 1970s second wave feminism way, but in an intersectional way that includes trans people, that includes same-sex couples, and also questions like, do we need to talk about abuse patterns in our schools, where our kids will be in a much better situation to then take that information forward and identify those problems in their maybe partners who didn't have that education, and to know that they need to intervene or get resources or get the hell out. You know, and
Yeah, yeah. That's a really important thing, and I think, well, a lot of people are susceptible to being in an abusive relationship. We tend not to think of men as vulnerable, but they can be very vulnerable. I think any man who's been in a 20-year marriage and then, you know, your wife leaves you, you're going to be vulnerable. That's something that's really important, and you might not see the red flags that come up. You know, that's, yeah, that education part of it is really important to me. And I hope we get a chance to do this. And one thing I should mention, by the way, with regard to the Indiegogo campaign for this documentary, we're nowhere near meeting our goal, but that's fine. I want to let people know that if they can support it, that'd be great, because we are moving forward with this anyway. We expected that we wouldn't make our goal. This is not something that people are interested in talking about that much anyway, but we're going to change that. And we're doing this in phases. So this is our first go at getting this to happen. Hopefully we can make enough that what we can do from this point is make a really good trailer and then go into phase 2. And of course, we're continuing this conversation. We'll continue to talk to people on YouTube, as well as having articles out there. We started the peer support group. We're moving forward. So I would really encourage people to look at helping out with the documentary, knowing that we are going into phase 2 almost right away. We'll continue to fundraise, and we will have a finished product that will be, I'm expecting it to be really good and entertaining and interesting, and also, you know, hopefully inspirational.
where will you be releasing the film?
Well, we're looking at getting it into film festivals for sure. That would be a huge thing. And of course, we're going to release it on YouTube. I'd love for it. I know a lot of people who are social workers. I know more social workers than I have friends, and they're interested in using it as an educational tool. There's so many avenues it could go. That's kind of exciting. You know.
Fantastic. Let's see. Oh gosh, it's been an hour. We're right on time. That's fantastic. So before we wrap up, is there anything that you had planned on talking about or usually talk about that we haven't covered in the discussion yet?
Sure. Just take a quick look. Not really. No, we got through a lot of stuff here, which is great. Just the last thing is that there seems to be a little bit of an invisible wall of silence around talking about male victims, which is slowly starting to change. And it's conversations like these that keep popping up that are great for that. I really hope that more and more people get interested in talking to male victims and people who are doing stuff about it. And if you know anybody who wants to talk to any of us, let us know. And there's lots of people that we reached out to who haven't responded, and we'd love to chat with them, you know, whoever they are. And we're really hoping for continuing this conversation and letting it evolve organically. And you know, I think that'll help a lot with breaking down this wall of silence. People haven't talked about male victims that much, and there isn't a whole lot of precedence for that. And maybe we need to establish making it so that people just get used to seeing it, you know. I think that could be great.
Yeah, I agree. It's a matter of, it's the whole consciousness raising I think that was big in the second wave feminism, but yeah, raising people's consciousness of the problem and getting them to reflect on their default socialized norms as to what victims look like. You know, who could be a victim? Even they can be a victim.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So this is part of that process, and I'm so grateful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, it's been great to have you on, and it's been a really interesting discussion, and I've learned a lot. And I would strongly encourage people who watch the video to support you in whatever small way they can. I'll be making a small contribution. I'll be monetizing this video, and then I'll be making contribution, like I'll do a $10 contribution in advance for any of the revenues raised off of the monetization of this video. So, because you don't make a lot on YouTube, but that should do me for like at least the next 4 or 5 years. So that's in terms of ad revenue.
That's fantastic. And
yeah.
I always encourage people. I worked in fundraising for a bit. People might go, okay, well, you're looking for $30,000, but I can only give you 10. Well, go ahead and give the 10 because that's going to make a difference. You know, it makes a huge difference. 100 people giving $10, yeah. 100 people giving $10 is a huge dent in where you need to be. Absolutely, and it's a triumph just to raise any money for this project in the first place. You know, that's a really great thing, and I love that feeling of cooperation with people and being part of a solution. And hopefully if people who do want to contribute think about it this way, it's not just contributing to making a documentary. We're working on a peer support group, we're working on a website, we're working on traveling, we're going to do talks, we're going to write ebooks. We have a lot on the go that we're really excited about, and it's part of that entire project, you know, which is great. Oh, and one thing I wanted to mention when it came to the title Male Tears, the reason that we came up with that title, originally I was going to call it Nothing to Forgive, but that doesn't really connote what it was about. And then somebody joked and said, you should call it Male Tears. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. But then I thought about it, and it became kind of poetic to me, that if you take that Male Tears phrase, but you put it against the context of a human being who's been terrorized and brutally hurt and is suffering psychological damage, those tears, you know, all of a sudden that becomes, it looks different in that light, you know?
Yeah, and getting men to the point where they don't feel embarrassed to express their emotions when they're having them I think would make for a much healthier and happier society. For people who haven't seen it, there's a TED Talk, I can't remember the name of the speaker, but it's called Be a Man. And he says that the 3 most harmful words that we say to our boys is to be a man, because it means stuffing down your emotions and solving things through anger and rage, or silencing yourself, not feeling things. And these are, it's an untenable cycle. That if it doesn't manifest in emotional traumas, then it's going to manifest in physical health problems. And we have an epidemic of men who, you know, are basically swallowing their emotions to death. And that's something that we can solve just by changing how we view men's emotions in our society. And that's completely within our power. Yeah.
Well, listen, what I loved about chatting about with you, as the last thing that I'll have to say is I feel that you're a very compassionate person, and it emanates just in your voice. I love that about you.
Thank you very much.
I really do. So, yeah. Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And if you want to stick around, I'm going to say goodbye to the viewers, and then we can chat a little bit off air. But for everybody who's watching, thanks for your time and attention. Don't forget to go below and go to the link for the documentary fundraiser. Give what you can. It's a really good cause, and it's a small way that you can be an ally to solving problems of victimization for persons regardless of their sex. In this case, the men who lack any services and support and the problems that they're facing. So thank you guys for watching. I've been Christy. You've been awesome. And from both of us, you want to say goodbye, Mal?
Bye. See y'all later.
See you guys later. Bye-bye.